Good afternoon and welcome to this Woroni Presents Current Affairs Q&A debate. Quite a mouthful, I think you'd agree. Wonderful, I've got to say, to see so many of you on such a splendid Canberra afternoon, so very late in semester 2, 2012. My name is Nicholas Farrelly and I'm an academic here in our ANU College of Asia and the Pacific. As it happens, my own work focuses on politics in mainland Southeast Asia, Thailand and Burma and such places. And so when I was asked to chair this evening's discussion, you'd all appreciate that I felt ever so slightly underqualified. Contemporary Australian affairs really isn't my thing. But I was told by those who invited me to shoulder this responsibility that it would be really easy. All I was going to have to do was to put on my best Tony Jones impression. That means that for those of you who are asking a question, I'll be prepared to take it as a comment. If you go on a bit too long, it should, I hope, in our format this evening, mean that all of you have a chance to have your say and to hear, of course, from our three very distinguished panellists, a real triumvirate of journalistic talent. I'll introduce them in turn. First we've got Jacqueline Maley, who writes press gallery dispatches for Fairfax. And when she's not writing her cheeky analytical pieces, she keeps 3,357 Twitter followers well entertained. And you may be wondering what ANU academics get up to on a sunny spring afternoon, and the answer is we read Twitter. So I've got a few choice nuggets here. I'll start with Jacqueline, and I've just got to quote it. She says, "Word, drinking during the day only works for me if I have allocated nap time built in." She also said, and this is in reference to last night's Q&A with Tony Jones, she says, "I didn't spot Scott Morrison as a gangster rap kind of guy." More seriously, and this is one of her more serious tweets, she does suggest that the spring racing carnival, was there ever a greater scam played on women? Good question. And in the context of a recent and very momentous day in Australian politics, Jacqueline wrote in 140 characters or less, "I know this is serious, but I wish Slipper had worn his frilly tie for this special occasion. It seems only right." Jacqueline, I couldn't agree more. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us all this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, Jacqueline Maley. Our second panellist is Bernard Keane, who is the Canberra opinion maker for Crikey, that insurgent, non-Fairfax online media empire. And Bernard, of course, goes hard on Twitter too. And just today, his 17,653 Twitter followers learned, and this is in reference to the final instalment of the US presidential debate, Obama details how he's made the world safe for capitalism. And then Bernard fired off an ambiguous missive about something in today's local news. He told us Simon Sheikh of Get Up fame wants to run for an ACT Senate position, ? That'll make voting on the Senate ballot easier for me. And then, and this is, I think, with reference to last night's Q&A hijinks, so Tony Abbott has lost the crucial Guardian reader vote. That'll cost him dearly. And for those of you who can't get quite enough of Bernard, you will be delighted to hear that he's going to be speaking at a Politics in the Pub function up in Sydney this Friday at the Gaelic Club, all around the hashtag NatSec inquiry. I had to look this one up. It sounds like a lot of fun, all about ASIO, all about surveillance. Bernard Keane, a man of many talents, welcome to the ANU. Thank you. And our final panellist is Phillip Coorey, who is the Sydney Morning Herald's chief political correspondent and a long-time parliamentary reporter. Now, Phillip also has a Twitter account. You can see where this is going, and he has a very respectable 8,984 followers. And Phillip is a prolific tweeter. He even hit up up at Woroni at 3:57 this afternoon in the following terms. Mate, could you email me directions for tonight? You seem to have lost them. Phillip, I've learned, gets caught up in all kinds of interesting Twitter conversations, almost all of which are far too long and involved for me to reproduce for comedic effect. But I will note that some of the phrases that have been tossed around even today are worth repeating. Moron, scandal, Australian Women's Weekly cover, and my personal favourite, GFC. I think we all thought we knew what that meant, but apparently GFC, get fucked, comrade. Hilarious stuff, this Twitter, and to round it all off, Phillip recently provided a public service by retweeting Alexander Downer's classic tweet from the 18th of October. Mr. Downer told us, "I have joined Twitter!" exclamation. Phillip Coorey, thank you very much again for taking the time. Round of applause. And as a very final Twitter-related aside, I note that Mr. Downer, with a grand total of 2 tweets, already has 612 followers. I think that's a very good strike rate. Mr. Downer, of course, had some brief words after the weekend's ACT election. He told us, great result for ACT Liberals in the ALP heartland. The Greens are on the way. Mr. Downer, let's see what our audience this evening thinks of all things contemporary Australian political affairs. As I've noted, we have a quite remarkable lineup of journalistic talent. They're here to answer your questions. Let's make this a conversation. Let's keep it informal and lively. As we go about that, I'd like to suggest that we will make our way through 3 broad topics. The first of those topics will be refugees. The second will be gender in Australian political life, and the third will be the future of journalism. 3 big, broad, I think potentially bruising topics, plenty for all of us to get our teeth into. And I'm going to kick us off here this afternoon by asking a question of all 3 of our panellists. This is a question which I hope will start to get them interacting with you as an audience. I hope that this, over the next hour or so, turns into a very productive dialogue. My first question is, what is the most important issue in Australian politics today that nobody's really talking about? And we might go, first of all, to Phillip.
Thanks. Hi everyone, can you hear me all right? I don't think there is one we're not talking about. I think there might be an argument over what gets an emphasis. I'm sure there's people here and everywhere else who probably get a little frustrated at what seems to get all the attention and things that don't get all the attention, but I think whatever happens to be resonant and whatever happens to matter at that time seems to get the most attention. And really, as much as we cover things, our focus is really on what's being stirred up and what themes the politicians themselves are setting. So if something's not being talked about, it's not necessarily because we, the media, aren't doing it, it's because they're not focusing on it much, or it's not being raised. But I can't think of anything off the bat that's important to Australia, that's important to politics, that is not being talked about. I mean, at various times, whether it's climate change or foreign affairs or the environment or personal stuff, it all seems to get a run around the park. It just depends on what day and who's stirring it up.
Jacqueline.
I struggle with this one as well, but I would just say generally, if there's not a sort of, lobby groups and, special interest groups, if you like, do have enormous power in this regard because they can come to Parliament and lobby politicians. So wherever you have an interest group that's willing to sort of push the case for something, then it's going to get a little bit of attention. I would have said sort of, underprivileged people and, something like, we've had a bit of a debate recently about whether or not to increase the dole, and that's something that is never going to be sexy. And it probably, I wouldn't say it's going to happen anytime in our future, whatever the strong case for it. I suppose issues like that are not sexy, and there's no political dividend in it for either party in doing something like increasing the dole.
I'm not sure it doesn't. It's not that it doesn't get any attention, but I think homelessness doesn't get enough attention. Kevin Rudd tried to be, amongst many other prime ministers, tried to be the homelessness prime minister, and actually made a lot of noise about homelessness. That kind of faded, obviously got overtaken a bit by the GFC, but that kind of has since faded. There have been some efforts by the government to kind of put a bit of attention back on it, but I don't think it gets enough attention, partly because it's one of those things that, as one of the world's richest countries, we can actually do something fairly significant about it. It's not like we're in the United States, where we've basically sort of adopted a mental health policy of putting mentally ill people on the streets. But it also ties in, I think, to another issue that doesn't get enough. Well, it gets plenty of discussion, but it doesn't get plenty of the right discussion, I don't think, which is actually housing and the level of housing stock in Australia. Homelessness and housing stock are actually unrelated, semi-related issues, because it's not so much directly about the lack of housing supply, but issues like social housing, the supply of housing for low-income earners.
And housing affordability.
These kind of well up periodically. They come to the fore because politicians decide to make something of them, or reports released, but they don't get a lot of systemic attention because there's not a lot of push there. Homelessness doesn't have a natural constituency. They're not, a lot of these people are just off the grid anyway, and the organisations that push on their behalf, don't get a lot of attention. So it's up to kind of the goodwill and the generosity of spirit of politicians to pick these issues up, and that's not necessarily a given that those sort of issues ever do get picked up. So,
would anyone in the audience like to pose a follow-up question there? If not, as I said, we've got our three big topics. We're going to be talking about refugees, gender and politics, and the future of journalism. We've already, I think, got some meaty insights from our panellists. Refugees. Where to start? And this is one that I suppose we're all aware has been rumbling along for more than a decade, and an issue which continues to loom very large in Australia's public debate. Perhaps it seems to some of us that Australian governments struggle to ever fully come to grips with it. So maybe the first question, just to get us all thinking around these issues, is this a problem that Australian governments of any stripe can solve to the constituency's satisfaction, or is it simply the nature of the beast that we will end up with a persistent issue? Phillip?
I've been around a long time, and I covered the Children Overboard and the Tampa and all that stuff when it was in 2001, that whole period, and nothing's really changed since then. We had, I think, it went out of the public consciousness for a lot of years because the boats stopped coming, so people stopped talking about it, and everyone pretended they were hip to the beat about it and were cool about it. That's because they didn't have to confront the images. But there is an ingrained intolerance in the majority of Australian voters towards people arriving by boat. They don't like the image, for whatever reason, and that controls the behaviour of the major parties. It doesn't matter what, 30 or 40% of the electorate thinks let them all in. It's the 60% who don't let them in, and that 60% that listens to Alan Jones and screams its head off, and Conservative politicians and increasingly Labor politicians play to that fear. And I think we're back to where we were in 2001. It's an enormously difficult issue because what happens if you do let them all in, like we're letting them all in as such at the moment, because there's no deterrence, as there has been for the last few years, then it's not just refugees that come, and then it starts to get polluted. You get economic refugees, or I've had briefings from people in the department who tell you, you can basically get from Tehran to Christmas Island in 5 days if you got the money. Now you don't have to be oppressed or running from torture or an awful situation. You just got the day you can get here and get a job and have a good life. And so the racketeers exploit the goodwill when you do open your borders, and those racketeers get exposed and they just poison the well for everybody, and it turns public sentiment against genuine refugees, and it becomes this self-fulfilling cycle. So, I know there's probably not a lot of John Howard fans here, and when I was first covering the Tampa and stuff, it was some really awful politics that was going on, but the demonisation of asylum seekers was such that I think back then that it's just become part of the mainstream now, and I don't know what the happy solution is. I think you do need to have a certain level of control of your borders and be able to a large extent allow who comes in, because if you do that, you can then give confidence to those coming in. I mean, it's not like it's to the exclusion. The government, I think this government has really wrestled with its conscience. They've gone from getting into power in 2008 and just abolishing all the Pacific solution and everything, and it just completely backfired on them. It was killing them. It was killing them in their electorates, and it might be a nice thing to do, but you're not going to be in government for long if you do just keep letting people in. So you've got to accept the political reality and find that medium. You find they've now pushed right back the other way. They've gone back to the Pacific solution, but at the same time they've increased the number of refugees we're taking from 14 to 20,000. That's a big increase. That's a huge increase. We're now the second highest country per capita for taking in refugees. So it's not all, it's not all punishment. There is a lot of, whatever. They're trying to find a medium, but if it doesn't work, it's going to be a really big issue at the election. And it might play out well in some audiences, but across Western Sydney and Western Melbourne and Northern Adelaide, it's rat poison. It's political rat poison. People out there just hate these people for whatever reason. They think they're coming here, taking our jobs. They read these chain emails, and it's really hard to fight that perception. You can't win on a lot of this stuff. So I think you can't be idealistic either way. You've got to try and find the middle road and balance it.
Jacqueline?
I think the problem is just as intractable as it ever was, and it's still going to be a massive headache for the government, coming up to the election, because whatever way you spin it, they've really buggered it up. They've tried all sorts of different things and nothing's worked. But I do think the way we talk about it is slightly different. I wasn't covering politics in the Howard years, but I was at university, and that was, Howard was like this most hated kind of, figure. And the way that we were talking about refugees then, or the way that the government and sections of the population were talking about refugees, was pretty xenophobic, and it reached its sort of zenith around, after September 11 and Tampa and what have you. And now I think we talk more in terms of, we want to stop the boats because we want to stop the loss of life, and because we want to let in the most. We realise that there's a finite number of places that we can, finite number of people we can take, and we want to take in the most worthy. So I'm a little bit optimistic in the sense that, after the Christmas Island tragedy, everybody wanted to stop the boats because they wanted to stop loss of life, as opposed for just purely xenophobic, like we don't want to let these bastards in. Whether or not that makes a difference to the end policy result, possibly not, but there's a difference in emphasis, perhaps.
Thanks, Jacqueline.
I don't think any country in the world actually handles refugee problems particularly well. I mean, you go to Italy or Greece, they face problems of refugees and unauthorised immigration from North Africa on a scale that dwarfs ours. And lots of lives on a far bigger scale than we see are lost in the Mediterranean of Africans trying to get to Europe. Elsewhere in the world, there's similar problems of maritime arrivals dying on their way to, or in the process of trying to reach some sort of sanctuary. So Australia's not alone in dealing with this, but we do seem to have, because Australians just seem to have this button that maritime arrivals push in us, we just don't seem to be able to think coherently or logically about it. We've got this predisposition, it seems, to have a real issue about maritime arrivals in a way that is not there about asylum seekers who might arrive by plane, and that predates the focus on saving lives. I mean, it's always been about this weird thing about boat arrivals.
I think the saving lives thing is overstated. I don't think people care that much. Like the majority care that much when there's a tragedy. I think it's a convenient excuse used by a lot of people.
But the political prism is now become we've got to stop the Christmas Island.
That's become
and it might be canned, but it's a slight difference.
Tony Abbott was told last year by the then Secretary of the Immigration Department that if you do the Malaysia solution, you'll stop the boats. Right? There's drastic. The same bloke who designed the Pacific solution, the same bloke who took the phone call from Captain Arnrinnen from the Tampa when he said, "Bugger you, I'm coming into Australian waters." There's a guy called Andrew Medcalf. This bloke has no allegiance to Labor or Liberal when it comes to border policy. He devised the Malaysia solution. He said it's hard, it's draconian, but it's only going to affect 800 people. We'll look after them when we send them back. But this is the equivalent of towing back boats. If we do this, this will stop. This will stop it. And the ruined Manus Island won't stop it. None of the old stuff will work again. Now, Abbott got that very same briefing, and he chose to ignore it because it was in his political interest that the boats keep coming. So every time a boat comes and sinks, and you hear this crap about, you know, oh, we're going to stop them. They have had a solution. The Parliament has decided not to adopt that solution because it's in the political interest of people, and I think that underscores pretty much the attitude of this Parliament. It's you know, fancy being told by the experts this will work and you choose not to do it because it's not your political interest to have this work. So don't believe all the ballyhoo you hear about, oh, we're so sad people are dying and being dashed on the rocks at Christmas Island. A lot of people don't mean it. It becomes a convenient excuse just to, you know, to do draconian things.
It's always been a convenient excuse. I mean, there's always been xenophobes who've run. I think Labor, you're right. Labor has genuinely wrestled with its conscience, and it's worked through the policy options about how you actually stop people from dying. And I actually think the Malaysian solution was the best approach from that point of view. And in some ways, actually, what we've got now is actually is A, going to be less effective, and B is more draconian than what we had. I mean, the real positive is that we've massively increased our intake of asylum seekers. Australia is one of the world's richest countries. We can afford to do that.
That would never have been on the table if we had, you know, that intake, which we can, you know, overwhelmingly, objectively say is a good result for refugees. That would never have been on the table. That would never have happened if we hadn't had all this debate. And it certainly wouldn't have happened under Herald.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Clearly, big topic. I can see a hand up down the back of the room. Just before you ask your question, it would be useful if you could identify yourself and state any relevant affiliation. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Josh Stone. I write Woroni every other edition when I can get my act together. My question is about, well, I want to refer to misinformation on behalf of politicians, and just with regards to what you said about the Tampa incident, Phillip, you covered that. And then you said that not much has changed since 2001. So do you think that the Tampa incident helped to ingrain an acceptance of misinformation and an acceptance that the government is able to perform, as Bernard said, quite draconian policy? Because we're now used to them, excuse the pun, tampering with what's going on. The information you're receiving. I didn't plan that.
That's a good question. I don't think there's misinformation now regarding what they tell us about asylum seekers. They're quite transparent. But misinformation used at the time of Tampa was such that it ingrained those prejudices. I mean, you've got to remember the Tampa came in August 2001. Howard had his back against the wall. He was going to lose the election. He was in trouble losing. Then we had 9/11. So this whole anti-Islam thing started. So we had this conflation between boat people and terrorists. And Peter Reith, I remember at this time, was endorsing comments by a US general that there could be terrorists on those boats. You know, and this whole country went bananas with fear after 9/11.
And people are drunk talking about it.
Yeah, exactly. So the misinformation is, that's right. Then we had kids overboard in the middle of that. And I remember I was in a hotel foyer in Perth during the election campaign, and Phillip Ruddock did a doorstop to announce that they'd been throwing their kids in the water. On one of they've intercepted this boat and they've been throwing their kids in the water. And we're all sitting there going, oh wow, this is terrible. And I remember this old guy, this old reporter had been around a while, and his bullshit detector went straight off. And he said, he just came, there was a guy called David Humphries who's just left the Herald, and he said, how do you know? He said, where's your proof? You know, this sort of thing. And he just weighed into Ruddock. But that was, he was the exception. You know, most of us swallowed it to our eternal shame.
Virginia Trolley on the ABC as well.
That's true. But then later in that election campaign, Howard went to the Fremantle docks to tour the HMAS Adelaide, which was the ship which picked up the people, I think, from the kids overboard people. And they had them on their ship for like a couple of days before they brought them to Australia. And he went to thank these brave heroes, who sort of, kept us scourged from our shores. And as we went onto the boat, we were told we're not allowed to interview the sailors or talk to anyone. We were told no interviews with any naval personnel, only the captain. And you could tell walking around that people were really uncomfortable. And I remember the sailor coming out and I remember muttering something, and sort of in the course of that, someone told someone it was all crap about children overboard, and a few days later it came out. So there was a deliberate. But by then the damage had just been done, and people wanted to believe it because they were, there was all this.
So the problem is the Australian psyche.
It's a big problem, and as Bernard was saying, pushing the button. I mean, there's a few people in the audience who remember. I was a kid in the 70s, but I remember the Vietnamese boat people coming. It was no different. They're bringing their gold with them. They're actually really rich. They're pretending to be poor. They're coming here. And there was boats on the news turning up with poor buggers from Vietnam escaping, the communists.
And it was Labor trying to
It
explain.
was Labor who was against it. Malcolm Fraser was bringing him in. So the Australian psyche has always been dust, and it wants to believe the worst. And if you've got the right government, it can stoke that stuff.
Hey, I'm Cameron Knott. I'm a former editor of Woroni. A question I had, which is broadly relates to like the media in general, but can be explored through the rubric of refugee coverage, is what role do you see the media playing in terms of leading the debate in Australia, and in terms of following the debate? So Phillip, you referred to 60% of the population, they surround chain emails, they take our jobs. What role do you see in the media as just reflecting that view back at people, but also perhaps engaging with it, perhaps changing it, challenging some of those chain emails?
I'll just be quick, but I think it doesn't matter how much I write, it doesn't change. For what I do, I'm a newspaper journalist. I think for every article I write, for every 100 articles I write, one out of Alan Jones just swamps it. And people believe what they want to believe. They choose to listen to what they want to listen to.
Our duty is to present the facts, and this is more than pretty much any other issue. This has been a debate where facts have been thin on the ground or ignored. But Phil's right. I mean, it's immensely difficult to. You're dealing with a reflex inside a lot of the population that isn't amenable to. I mean, there comes a point where people just are resistant to facts, and sometimes it's only a small proportion of the population who are resistant to facts. Climate change is an example of that. There's a set proportion of the population who just will never accept climate change because they just don't want to. It doesn't matter how much evidence you expose them to. With asylum seekers, I think there's a substantial proportion of the population, maybe it might be half, might be more, that are just not amenable to facts about all this, and therefore they are enormously receptive to hearing whatever they want to hear, and politicians will eagerly exploit that. So when people say, sure, there have been repeated instances of the media, and continue to be of the media, beating up the asylum seeker issue, misreporting the asylum seeker issue, but in a sense, they are playing to a market that already exists and will exist regardless of what journalists do.
And nowadays, more than ever, you can choose your facts. You can choose which facts you want because you're not just confined to what you see on the TV or read in the paper or the mainstream paper websites. You can look up some bloke just writing complete and utter crap, on a blog and stating it as fact. There's a market for everything out there now. You can read whatever you want to read. It's all stated as fact, whether it is or isn't. And so, our effect as a mainstream player is diluted by that, even though we are bound by rules, which of sort of accuracy and objectivity, and it's got to be sort of true or backed up. Whereas people just state things as fact now on just on a blog site or something, and people use that to back their views. You can go now and find something, a fact which supports your preconceived position.
It seems quite nihilistic that then people's attitudes will never change because they'll just keep confirming what they believe, and we can't do anything to change that. Do you think that's a...
Well, but if you look at, I'm a little bit more optimistic than that. I mean, if you look at what I look at what we've gone through with successive waves of immigration in Australia. I mean, when I was a kid in the 70s, it was still the legacy of the post-war immigration period. So, Italians and Greeks were still the kind of the typecast villains of Australian immigration. That was that disappeared in the 80s. In the 80s, it became Asians, and by the time Pauline Hanson came along, Asians are kind of disappearing off the racist agenda a bit. She kind of tried to revive it, but by last decade it became Muslims, and I'm sure that at some stage we're going. And then later on we found new sort of villains. So Somalis in Melbourne.
Watch out, Africans.
Yeah. So look, Australia kind of.
I always find when jokes start appearing about you accepted. Yeah. Well, when an ethnic group starts.
Something like the joke about the Vietnamese who robs your house and does your homework.
Yeah, that's right.
That's something kind of circulated in the mid-80s
and once that joke becomes in, you're hip to the beat. And as I remember, God, it's like wogs, I mean, I'm of Lebanese extraction, so no one quite knew what I was as a kid, and I grew up in a town full of everybody. So so it was under the radar a bit, but the Greeks and Italians got smashed, you know, wogs, you know, this sort of thing, and, you know, wog food and wog that, and now, imagine saying, you know, I mean, that was only 20 years ago, and then suddenly you have jokes about wogs, and you know, wogs out of work was a, you know, it's pretty pithy now, but back when it came out it was really quite funny, and it was Greek and Italian comedy actors doing this spoof on themselves and their own culture, and then they became mainstream. That's right. I think, you know, it's someone's always getting it in the neck, and yeah, I agree.
But as each new candidate arrives, the old ones kind of become mainstream in a way that
they start telling jokes about the next one.
So, yeah, it's always the drawbridge in regards to that. So I'm a bit more optimistic about our capacity to actually change, but it does seem like, you know, with this issue, I mean, I was working in the federal court back in the early 1990s when it was Nick Bolkus and Jerry Hand were the immigration ministers, and they were getting stuck into voter rights. I mean, that's when the Keane government established mandatory detention. So this issue's been around for 20 years, and it is pretty intractable. But you know, Australians do have a capacity to kind of slowly move beyond sort of the fashionable prejudices of the day. I guess the issue is just how long it's going to take.
Do we have any final questions on the topic of refugees? Got at least one hand up in the middle there. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Saga. No affiliation, I live in Woroni. I just want to ask something that you touched on before, Jacqueline, about the current political debate, and that it's centred more around how to save lives, how to stop the tragedies, and whether you think that should be the focus of politicians now. And if so, how does the Australian government, you know, follow that up? Like, is it really their problem that they can control the push factor in these countries where people are saying to come from? Or?
No, absolutely not. And I mean, the push factors at the moment are quite enormous, particularly, you know, with the war, the theatres of war in the Middle East and South Asia. So no, and that is actually, talking of things that don't get a lot of political attention, push factors get almost no political attention because nobody gets any benefit out of talking about them because they're out of the control of politicians. I think I mean, you know, whatever you might think about the Greens and whatever you might think about their policies, and you know, I'm not a huge fan, but they certainly, their presence, I think, in the debate is quite a good force for the humanitarian agenda, if you like, and it sort of keeps everybody honest in that sense. So I don't know, as long as we have more and more of a focus on the humanitarian reasons why we take refugees, and the fact that we need an orderly queue, like I really do believe that. I think that, you know, if you don't have an orderly system, then you can't bring the public with you. You can't overcome people's prejudices against refugees and against foreigners. So if you have what looks like a good system, then I think Australians will happily take more and more refugees. But you do want to take the most worthy ones as well if you can.
So we'll go very briefly back over here to the left.
Do you think that the prejudices might work in favour of what's politically easier to do? And do you think those prejudices might have been not cultivated from square one but played upon?
I think, take the Malaysian solution for example. That was not a very politically easy thing for the government to do. It could dress it up nicely as a way of stopping the votes, but it was a complex, nuanced policy that was actually designed to achieve, I think, quite a humanitarian end. And of course, they were getting beaten up mercilessly from both the left and the right. But they had adopted what I thought was actually, in logical terms, the least unhumanitarian policy. And that's the thing with asylum seekers. You can only ever come up with the least unhumanitarian policy. You can't come up with a humanitarian policy. There's too many refugees around the world who want some form of sanctuary. The UNHCR doesn't have enough resources to process the ones that are there. There's not enough countries that want to take refugees. There's always going to be, quote unquote, the queue. And so the government was stuck with this really tough policy option, and it put together a solution that I think, it was too small in scale, but nonetheless it had the basis of, I think, a pretty reasonable solution, and it got beat up, from all directions for that. And eventually, and now it's stuck with the odium of having tried that particular solution and not got it through Parliament, so it's perceived as incompetent, and faced High Court problems as well. So, I think Labor actually made a pretty decent fist of trying to come up with a good policy. in terms of all the factors that you need to consider. It's with an issue like this, you can confuse. I think you can confuse what is humanitarian and moral for an individual to do versus what it is humanitarian and moral for a government to do. Governments are not individuals. Governments have to weigh up the competing demands of, first of all, their own citizens, and then, a wider number of people, in this case. And the logic that plays out for the way governments behave is different to the rules that apply to you and I. And that's not to excuse governments behaving amorally or immorally. It's to say that when you're making these sorts of decisions that affect this person over here versus that person over there, or that group versus this group, then the moral calculations become much, much more complex. And that's what the Malaysian solution seemed to me to be trying to kind of work out is, how do we actually have the least worst impact here in terms of trying to resolve this issue?
And I think that's where the Greens have just completely stuffed up, because Labor tried to do the right thing when they came into government. They got rid of all these draconian, temporary protection visas and shutting the rule and that sort of thing, and it just backfired. Push factors or not, people just started coming in gangbusters again, became a political problem. And the Greens, who Labor needed to help them, if you want to keep having people coming in on an orderly basis and so forth and not go back to the coalition approach, you're going to have to help us a bit here and give us Malaysia or something like that. And they said, no, let them all in. They had an absolute approach to it. They just couldn't bring themselves to having any sort of offshore processing. And so they wouldn't help Labor with the Malaysia bill. And so they don't have an argument for what's happening now. Every time a boat sinks, Sarah Hanson-Young disappears, because what we have now is essentially Greens policies, just open slather. And as Bernard said, there's like 4 million refugees at any given time in camps. I mean, if you have open slather, they'd all come here if they could. And why wouldn't you? It's a good place to come. But you can't help everybody, so you've got to sort of try and manage the thing regionally and Malaysia wasn't just on its own a deterrent measure. It was actually we heard a lot of lip service paid to having a regional solution. That means you've got to work with the Indonesians and the Malaysians and so forth to try and manage this. And that was an important first bilateral arrangement towards doing something on a larger scale in the region. So Sarah Hanson-Young will come out and go, we need a regional solution, but then we'll won't even let them take the first step towards one. So I agree. I think Labor's just been completely conflicted by this, and I think the Malaysia solution was a big loss, and it'll never come back. It'll never get through this parliament, and you might find Tony Abbott might, if he becomes Prime Minister, might suddenly think it's not such a bad idea, though, because what's happening now isn't going to stop, and it's not going to stop when he's in government. It's going to become a problem for him.
And on that note, I think one hand came up very quickly. Let's go to you very briefly, if you don't mind. Thank you.
I wonder if you see any relationship between the generational changes around accepting different ways of migrants. Oh, sorry, I'm Judy, I'm not in relation to the issue of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia and the attitudes of the majority of the population, where you see any relationship between the fact that perhaps we get that generational acceptance of the Greeks and Italians, for example, but from my own personal experience, I don't see that happening in terms of that group of the population that has those, I guess, discriminatory and racist attitudes to the inclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people into the workforce education.
Is it the same people who don't like both people who don't like?
And whether you see any optimism, any links, or whether you see them separate kinds of...
I see them as separate, I think. I mean, there's obviously, not mutually exclusive. I mean, Hanson tried to conflate the whole thing, and so that rump of people who still describe to that type of philosophy, but no, I see it not the same group totally.
I think the problem is that despite most Australians will regularly deal with, I should have here in Canberra, will regularly deal with people of a wide variety of backgrounds who might be Greek or Italian or Vietnamese or Muslim, but there's still this issue that a lot of us just don't have regular contact with people of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander heritage. Yeah. And there remains, they're kind of still this sort of other, and political debate kind of tends to treat them as recipients of policies and passive, and not people of their own sort of agency. So that's very different to the way that we kind of interact with the successive ways of immigration.
I would agree with that. I think for a variety of socioeconomic reasons, Aboriginal people seem to stand apart from the political consciousness, and they're treated very much as outsiders. Whereas successive waves of immigrants tend to get dispersed more generally amongst the population, so that it becomes much more normalised.
It's pretty hard to argue those people shouldn't come here. They're not entitled to come here and take the same sort of mindset against those who are here first. So, it's probably slightly different things.
We'll go very quickly to a final question on the topic of refugees.
Yeah, so I just wanted to elaborate on your question. My name is Maya. I'm from New Zealand, and for me, I was actually writing an essay about refugees today. In Chinese, it was really simple. But I started thinking about that, and then I also do Pacific Studies, and so New Zealand's treatment of Pacific Islanders, for example, and we used to, be involved in Samoa and had a very open policy when we pulled out and Samoa gained independence and had citizenship for years, and now we have a sort of 1,000 people a year quota. Whereas Australia's treatment of Papua New Guinea, you pulled out and then nothing, right? There's hardly any immigration from Papua New Guinea here, and sort of wipe your hands of those obligations. And for me, there seems to be some really, entrenched cultural thing, like Josh was mentioning about the Australian psyche. And I was just thinking about it, quite left field, but maybe that had something to do with the way Australia was colonised and subsequent treatment of the Indigenous population. I don't know if you want to comment on that, because New Zealand's a very different case.
I'm married to a New Zealander. New Zealand is radically different in its treatment of its First Peoples compared to us. But New Zealand's also in a different section of the world. New Zealand is not a arrival point for maritime arrivals. It's very hard to get to New Zealand by boat. So there is not the. I don't think there is not the same sort of. In terms of this sort of button that Australians seem to have about maritime arrivals, we are positioned in the world in a way that is going to maximise the sensitivity of that. Because, first of all, people can reach us by boat. Secondly, we're the only country that's signed up to the Refugee Convention before New Zealand. So, we're peculiarly exposed in that sense to the issue. That's not to kind of excuse it. And as I said at the start, New Zealand it seems to me to have a far healthier internal life about its First Peoples and about the whole issue of immigration than Australia does. Despite the fact that Australia is an enormously successful immigrant nation, we're kind of messed up about it. We're still kind of messed up about it, even though the evidence of how successful we are is all around us every day. I agree.
Yeah.
Okay, lots of nodding heads up the front, which I will take as my cue to do a bit of a pivot and take us in the direction of gender and politics. And you all know what the next word out of my mouth is going to be: misogyny. And I know that exactly the groans among our panellists and I did have plans to pivot perhaps in Bernard's direction initially, at least, because I know that you've written at some length riffing on this notion that there was a conspiracy theory and that the Macquarie Dictionary had changed its meaning. Not as grand a conspiracy, you suggested, as the Illuminati secretly controlling the world or the shopping list of people who killed JFK, but nonetheless a good conspiracy theory. Bernard, could you kick us off perhaps by sharing some of your thoughts on this issue?
Well, I had sort of a twin reaction to the issue, and I feel really odd being a male and talking about misogyny. There's sort of a threshold issue for me, but it doesn't sort of seem to stop me from talking about it. But there's the two issues. For one, first thing I found it an enormous distraction, and I think there is a readiness on the part of some people and some in the media to trivialise gender issues as somehow not quite as important as other stuff. And I thought this kind of fitted into that. And secondly, I just didn't understand why Macquarie was wanting to fiddle with the meaning, because as far as I could see, I thought what Julia Gillard was saying about, certainly the quotes that she was invoking against Tony Abbott, I think her wording was pretty reasonable. I've got an issue with this characterisation of Tony Abbott the current Tony Abbott as a misogynist. I just don't think that's correct. But nonetheless, I think we are or we were talking about the issue of misogyny, because when you're talking about the issue of the role of the capacity and the right of women to participate fully in every level of society, if you're up against someone who just doesn't think they do have either the right or the capacity to do that, then that seems to me to be one of the most extreme forms of misogyny that there actually are. So I think, in terms of definitional terms, we're on pretty safe ground to say, look, these issues are fundamentally about not just casual sexism, of which there is plenty, of course, but something more fundamental about the role of women in society, and what expectations women can legitimately have about the way our civil society operates. So that was where I was sort of coming from that particular issue.
Jacqueline.
Well, I don't know, I've got so much to say on that, but don't get me started. The biggest problem I suppose I had with that whole week was people who did try to characterise it, including the coalition, as distraction and the politics of personal vendetta, and that might have been an element to it. I've got no doubt that the Labor Party is very strategically painting Tony Abbott as an unreconstructed sexist. Whatever the truth of that may be. But I think it was a debate that we needed to have. I think it was the first time that Julia Gillard actually acknowledged the elephant in the room, which is that she's the first female Prime Minister and she's been the target of monstrously sexist attacks for her entire Prime Ministership. And we also have a lot of really sort of gifted women very prominently on the government front bench. So I think this is the natural conclusion of giving women the vote, and then having them climb the ladder up into Parliament. Sooner or later, you're going to have a debate about matters that matter to women, and one of those is whether or not they face sexism in their workplace or in society. So I think it was a debate we needed to have. It might have gotten a bit silly, and we might have gone on for a little bit too long, but I'm sure it'll correct itself.
I think it was a good thing to do. My question may be the timing, just look at the whole context of the slipper thing. But I started noticing this soon after Gillard became Prime Minister. Actually, during the election campaign, some of the stuff being said on radio was just out of control. Biffo and Bongo on something FM, and whatever for an interview, and it was just disgraceful stuff. I covered Howard for over a decade. I covered Rudd's short term, and I noticed pretty early after the election, the disrespect with which Gillard was being treated was completely different. I'd never seen that applied to Howard or Rudd, by opposition politicians or radio commentators or stuff. And it was little things. It was little. I remember walking after question time, and this is going back about 18 months as well. After one question time, and I was walking with Gillard back to her office. I wanted a buttonhole about something I was writing, and as I was walking with it, Joe Hockey, who's a nice guy, Joe, he's not a mean fellow, but him and Christopher Pine were heckling her. They were walking in the corridor and they were heckling her behind her and saying, "You're drowning, Julia, you're drowning, Julia," and Hockey was singing this song. And I thought, I'd walked with Howard 1,000 times after question time. I'd never seen him heckled in the corridor. And it just reminded me of, beating up on the girl in the schoolyard sort of thing. And that's when I first started really noticing it, and I started writing about it. I have a column on Mondays, I did the odd column about it. And I have a regular spot on radio, and I was talking about it then, and I was just sort of saying this is starting to creep in, and I think it's just gone on and on and on, and we've seen, it's just a little bit here, a little bit there, and I think with Gillard, obviously she's been absorbing it and she's picked it up, and that day in Parliament she just went bam, and it just came out. Now, again, I wasn't one on the side of, I thought the biggest story that day was Peter Slipper, and I thought it was a good rearguard action in a political bind by the Prime Minister. But you could see, obviously, that it struck a chord out there just by the extent of the reaction that speech got and still continues to get. And I might have missed that on the day myself, but I can see now why she said all that. But this has been building for a while. Is it misogyny? I didn't actually know what the word actually meant literally until I think chauvinism was the word people were looking for that week, maybe rather than misogynist. But I don't think Abbott's a misogynist in the literal meaning of the word at all. But I think it just sort of reflects probably, a problem a lot of blokes had with a female Prime Minister, and it was subconscious. It was just coming through subconsciously all the time.
For our first question, we had at the front. Thank you.
Jacqueline, I suppose this is more a question for you as a woman. I noticed when Julia came in, I thought to myself, this is great, a female Prime Minister, women around show that she'll support so women should get behind other women, we're a minority and we're being suppressed in history. Then Germaine Greer, like I'm sure you know about this, sort of famous feminist, comes out and criticises her for what she's wearing and says that that's one of the reasons that she's not so popular. Do you think the problem is that as part of feminism, that women just can't get behind other women, and that as women we criticise her for her voice and for her dress, and we rather than looking at what's important, like her policies and stuff, and why do you think it is that women can't support other women?
Well, I mean, I think Gillard has a lot of really strong female supporters within her party and within her, on her front bench. So, I think they're probably quite solid with each other. Within the context of their workplace. I know what you're saying. I think more generally women can be really like each other's toughest judge, and whether or not you want to start, I don't know, talking about whether or not they've absorbed some sort of sexism in there, I don't know, unleashing it upon their fellow women. It is really disappointing when, people like Germaine Greer come out and say that sort of stuff, but to me that just says that she's not the intellect or, the public intellect that she once was, rather than, making any great statement about, the ability of women to stand behind other women.
We had the resurface debate in our office, because I noticed really early on all the stuff was getting home on Gillard was coming from women. Like they were writing articles, what was the name, I forget the Australian, but this whole article about her earlobes. About the size of her earlobes. And someone was writing about, and I didn't, because I'm a bit of I don't just get this stuff anyway, I don't really notice that sort of stuff. That her roots were whatever, and shit. And there was a train of articles for the first few months when she was the leader and then Prime Minister, and it was all by women. And I said, "You're own worst enemy. You're the ones that are, generically speaking." And that's now abated, I think, except for Greer when she pops up every now and then. But
we weren't used to having a female Prime Minister, and I suppose we're used to seeing women. Yeah, we definitely had different standards for the way that we wanted Gillard to groom herself.
Even once Michelle Grattan tucked or something Gillard was wearing, and I said, when are you kid? I mean, we all had a bit of fun with Howard's eyebrows and his glasses and so forth, but other than that, it just...
But I mean, on that point, I do think that, I wrote about, Gillard, the sort of the now famous misogyny speech, and I wrote about it sort of the day after it happened, and that was after I'd sort of spoken to a lot of women, within Fairfax. We have a women's website that I write for as well, Fairfax website. All of those girls, a lot of my friends, people's grandmas, women across the board that I know, in and outside of Canada, were saying to me that this was a wonderful thing and that they were transfixed by it. So I do think there was a lot of air punching, go sister kind of reaction from females to that speech. So that tells me that it touched a chord and that other women do feel some sense of solidarity with Gillard on that front, whether or not they like her or like her policies.
Thank you, Jacqueline. We have our next question again right down the front.
Hi there, I'm Daniel, managing editor of Woroni at the moment. I wanted to ask, I've seen in the last about 4 years a commentary surrounding the way MPs and senators conduct themselves in Parliament. Language to describe men when they're up in Parliament, when they're yelling and bellowing, the words seem to be more positive. When you look at how you might describe Gillard or Anna Burke, words are used like shrieking and wailing. Do you think that the media has a responsibility to use more neutral language in regards to these matters?
Well, not if you write in colour, because then you'll just be right. I mean, I basically write, in colour and observation. So, if I can't use interesting verbs, then I'm kind of screwed. But I struggle with that. I struggle with whether or not I'm being inadvertently sexist. If you say that, Gillard's being shrill, or even someone like Christopher Pine, who, you don't want to say anything. You don't want to say anything that's offensive, or use a verb or a descriptor that might be offensive. And it's the same thing with writing about clothes. Like if I'm doing an observation piece, one of the first things I want to talk about is what people are wearing. And women have, generally in Parliament wear much more interesting things than the men do. But you kind of have to mediate yourself, or I really struggle with it. So I don't know.
I've stopped myself from making any comments about the way any MP dresses, because I used to quite like making observations about people's clothes, and obviously you're going to make more comments about female MPs than males. And then I thought to myself at some point, well, not maybe it's just I was wary of unconscious sexism, but I just decided that I'll just leave that sort of thing behind. one of the language that we use about female politicians is I think important, because we do kind of use different language, I think, and female politicians do get treated differently in the media, and always have, and continue to do so, and be so. And I think women are much more sensitive to that than men are. That's something the really interesting poll result we got a couple of weeks ago from Essential, that a lot more women thought that Julia Gillard and female politicians generally copped, a raw deal compared to men. So it's something that I think women are much more attuned to. And I suspect one of the reasons that Julia Gillard has elicited such anger and hate, putting aside policy issues like the carbon price and the perception of a broken promise, is that she doesn't behave like a traditional female politician in some ways. And she says all these things with Julie Bishop, but she's aggressive. She's being sort of pretty nakedly ambitious, which is not a feminine thing at all.
She's as tough as goes,
and she's tough. She hasn't kind of modulated a voice to be, or if she's tried to, she's failed miserably. To kind of have a nicer voice. She's this sort of what you see is what you get type figure, and she doesn't have kids. And I think a lot of people, of a more conservative mindset, look at her and just don't like. They don't like women like that. They feel
they don't get women like that.
If she had kids, she would be Prime Minister, because Tony Abbott's lucky and Johnny Albert's lucky and Kevin Rudd's lucky they had wives who raised their kids and allowed them to continue their careers unbroken. She's had to continue her career unbroken to get to where she is, and the consequence of that, you don't have time for motherhood. No, I agree. She plays it like a bloke. She plays in a bloke's world like a bloke. She's got to where she is because she joined the toughest faction in the ALP, the left. Not probably because she was particularly left, but that was where all the fist fighting was done. She fought her way up through the left. She got herself a safe seat. She got herself in a parliament, got herself on the front bench, as Prime Minister. I mean, if she were a bloke, she'd be, bloody,
What the
ambition
would be something that
would be a positive. Yeah, it'd be a positive. Whereas Rudd did the same. They both came into Parliament at the same time. They're both similar ages, similar people. Both, I think, were completely underdone when they got into leadership positions, and that's half the reason for a lot of problems we have now. But Rudd was this, he climbed over people and he took people out in front of him, and good on him, and knocked off Beazley, knocked off Howard, became Prime Minister after 10 years in the House, and that was a cool thing. But she sort of did the same thing, and it was conniving, scheming, that sort of
unnatural.
I think male politicians benefit from having the short, like when they have a wife and children, it's a sort of a shorthand amongst voters for a soft side, a heart, a warmth. That they've got a home and hearth that they go to. Gillard doesn't have the benefit of that. Because of her life circumstances, so people do see her as harder than she is. Even someone like Margaret Thatcher had Dennis, who was sort of this doddery old, gin-soaked fool. But at least, it was someone who loved her and who softened her a little bit. And she had children too. But Gillard doesn't have any of that. So we see her. I think there is a perception that she's harder somehow.
Every politician, every Prime Minister that Australia's had, certainly going back to Gough, have been intensely ambitious people, and usually men who would do anything to become Prime Minister. And Malcolm Fraser almost tore the country apart. Most of you would now think Malcolm Fraser is soft old lefty, but he was the Tony Abbott of his day, and he damn near tore the country apart in his quest to get the Prime Ministership. Bob Hawke was so obsessed with his own messianic genius that he was prepared to do anything to become Labor leader. Paul Keane almost tore his own party apart. John Howard had so many goes at trying to become leader.
He was testimony to persistence.
Exactly. And Kevin Rudd, was his
the most nakedly ambitious.
Exactly. and then Julia Gillard, just last week, I think it was Christopher Pyne, was haranguing the Prime Minister for being, talking about her ruthless ambition, as though that was a bad thing. So, when a woman's like that, it's supposed to be this sort of thing that this sort of button you can push about her. But when a man's like that, that's what men are supposed to be like. And that's, when it comes to politics. Malcolm Turnbull would say, Malcolm Turnbull never bothered to hide his particular light under a bushel about wanting to become Prime Minister. So that's probably one of the most fundamental double standards. Never mind stuff fixation on appearances. One of those fundamental double standards is that female politicians aren't given the permission that society gives male politicians to want the top job, and do anything to get it.
Thanks, Bernard. Thanks, Phillip. Thanks, Jacqueline. I've got one final question on the topic of gender over here on my right. Yes, please.
My name's Alex. I'm an English student. And just following on from that point, do you think there's an element of hypocrisy from both sides of Parliament? So the atrocious way that Gillard is being treated. You can see parallels in that. Rowan Bishop talking on Kitchen Panel last week, that issue she had in the 90s. Some of the characterisations of Gina Reinhardt that don't apply to other men in their situation. I wonder what perception, what comments you have on that.
No,
and also, really quick question. One of the biggest issues coming out of Gillard's speech in Parliament was whether or not the press gallery had commented and reported on the issue accurately. Lenore Taylor wrote a really good piece in the SMH defending the press gallery because there's a lot of online bloggers, the press gallery discuss the Slipper issue mainly, whereas online bloggers discuss the feminist issue. Do you think the press gallery responded accurately to this issue?
The second bit first, I have this sort of problem with the concept of the press gallery being a sort of single cellular organism that, like Jackie wrote a piece, Jackie's in the press gallery, and she wrote a piece kicking the press gallery. Right, there was a whole divergence of views within the press gallery. And as my job as the correspondent was to write the news story that day, what is the news story? And it unfolded at 1,000 miles an hour, right? And it unfolded over like an 8 or 9 hour period. The story that day was the Slipper experiment had exploded. And they got into question time and they were caught with their pants down, and Abbott moved a no confidence motion and completely trapped them, completely ambushed the government because they hadn't anticipated it when everyone else had sort of anticipated it. So in what was an amazing, as I said, rearguard action, Gillard just pulled out that speech and said, "Don't you lecture me about misogyny, mate," and blah, 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 blah. But after that speech was over at 2:30, the story was still developing. And Slipper, we had independents going, I was in the Parliament till 10 o'clock that night until I got the final story. And the final story was Slipper had resigned because while Gillard was on her feet, the independents had gone in to see him and said, "You don't quit, you're out, we're going to push you out," sort of thing. And so in the whole blur of that day, the sharp end of that story for me was, the next day on the front page of the Herald, Slipper forced out by independents, as Gillard and Abbott just tear it. Abbott gave a fairly strong speech about Gillard that day too. They tore each other's throats out. To me, the news element to me that day was this mutual loathing they have of each other was laid bare. And I had slabs of her speech in the main story, but just because, say, Phil Coorey didn't put Gillard's speech at the top of the story, because that wasn't the story that day. Other people wrote about the speech and it got covered. So I think, I don't think we sort of failed as a collective or individuals. Some people wrote about it, some didn't, and it got...
I don't know, I feel a little bit, I feel sympathy on both sides, but I know, I was again talking about it with friends on the weekend at a barbecue in Sydney, and they were all saying, I've never before read the papers in the morning and felt such an enormous gulf between what I thought seeing the day unfold in Parliament and what I read in the papers the next day. And I'm not talking so much about the news that Phil writes, but more sort of analysis. And it's not that I'm going to kick any of my colleagues, but I do think there was something going on out there that we failed to get in the press gallery, and I don't think it was a coincidence that failure or that gulf between people's perceptions and what was written in the newspapers was not a result of the fact that most of the people writing the news that day and supplying their commentary were men, were middle-aged men. That's most of the people who write in the mainstream media, I guess, and who present the news, the night news.
I thought the press gallery sort of reported the tactical situation pretty well, but what they missed was what was happening in the wider community, and it was clearly that there was some sort of reaction within the wider community. It wasn't just, you know, amongst people on Twitter or people on Facebook. It had a wider resonance, and it's not entirely irrelevant that it got some sort of, you know, international exposure as well. And I really, was the press gallery any better place than anyone else to kind of identify that, you know, the way that speech caught fire more broadly? I'm not sure that they were. I mean, they were doing their main job, which is to report the tactical situation that's going on in Parliament.
Yeah.
And you've got to tell it didn't really catch fire until after the event. I mean, it wasn't really until the next day or so this thing really started to, you know, develop a life of its own. It got picked up overseas, and those are, you know, on the day it wasn't that apparent. It was, you know, it was a good speech, it was a fiery speech, and it got, you know, written up in context.
Maybe that's it, because, you know, as Phil was saying, like, it was a really full-on day. It was an exciting speech, and I think we were all transfixed when we were watching it.
But it was one element. It was one element.
Then you go back to the office, and it's like, then, you know, we heard just before deadline that, or actually a little bit after deadline, that Peter Slipper was about to resign. So we're like, shit, that's the story now. We've got to recalibrate and refit the paper so that we can get that news in for the readers. And then, as Phil said, like, he was there really late because, you know, we didn't exactly know what was going to happen with the next speaker, and people had to wait around to have the next speaker instated. So sort of like the day runs away with you, and that's the cycle, the daily cycle of a news day in the traditional sense. But I think what we saw was that news cycle is getting messed up, you know, or that news cycle is sort of getting interrupted by the speed at which things can travel online. So it was really, I mean, it was really, really interesting on a lot of different levels. But people were pretty harsh on the press gallery, and I probably was too. But, you know, a job like Phil's job is really, really difficult and really long, and you have to see the minutiae of the day and work out how the day's going to end. And the story had moved on a little bit from Gillard's speech. Yeah.
And on that note, I'm going to throw this open for questions on our final topic for this evening, which is the future of the media. I expect that
group suicide.
So let's see how we go here. I might, because I'm anticipating a fair few questions. We might take them in batches, if that's okay. You guys have got time. I'm just aware that we will at some stage this evening get kicked out of the John Curtin School of Medical Research. So in an effort to get through a bunch of these, let's take them in a batch. If you've got a microphone near you, we'll go to you first. Thank you very much, and we'll go from there.
I had a question about the future of how the sort of media is financed in terms of paywalls and subscriptions. Do you think that paywalls and subscriptions will lead to sort of inequality of information among the public? And sort of two follow-on questions from this possible inequality. Do you think that will have effects for compulsory voting in Australia, which relies on a bare minimum of information among all voters? And do you think it will have effects for the ABC as a non-paywall media source for all Australians?
Thank you. We'll come to an answer to that, Phil, in a minute, if you don't mind. Yes, next question.
This is kind of gender and media intertwined. Like, we're seeing at the moment Abbott playing his audience with his, particularly pertaining to his comments this morning about Julie Gillard not necessarily understanding what it was like coming back in relation to baby bonus, and then Julie Gillard crying out about discrimination and discrimination she has kind of experienced. It relates to the 24-hour news cycle and the fact that we're kind of missing the larger debate. Like, the media quite often forgets to mention that there's a 17% gender pay gap that exists within Australia, as high as 20%, 25% in some industries, and there are only 2% of CEOs on ASX 200 companies are women. The fact that Michaela Cash is currently in the process of tearing down the office for women and the legislation in some estimates. And I think the media has kind of jumped on the speech as, you know, the beacon of gender, kind of the gender debate, when it really isn't. There are a lot of really hard-working NGOs in the sector that are trying to bring more pressing issues that are around every woman to the fore. Do you think that it's the media's responsibility to kind of bring that to the fore? And the fact that we politicians kind of haven't talked about it at all is a statement that we're really missing in the debate.
Well, can
we go to one more, if you don't mind? I can see somebody with a microphone over here. We'll go to you, and then we'll bring this back to our panel.
Bit of a difficult batch of questions for you to answer, but congratulations on all still being employed. And I was wondering, kind of related to your employment, do you feel that the way in which you write is at all influenced, or has been at all influenced by the changing nature of the environment in which you work?
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, ABC question, or paywall question. It's going to be very hard to make serious money out of websites. Well, we've got a quality free website, the ABC. You know, Bernard's Crikey is probably the best and most enduring and one of the first, but it's very typical. We're struggling. We can't make money out of our website no matter how we try. It's, you know, because no one wants to pay for news. Why are you going to pay for it when you can just log on to abc.net or MSN or whatever like that? So unless you can offer something that no one else can, and it's very hard to get a critical mass that's going to make that profitable, it's going to be really difficult. It costs a lot of money to have to get news. We're not talking here opinion or blogs, to actually find news, to pay journos, to fly overseas, to lodge FOI applications, to drive around the country, do whatever you've got to do. It costs millions and millions of dollars, and if you ain't got that money, you're not paying it anymore, the whole thing will fragment. On your excellent observation, I thought, yeah, absolutely, all the froth and bubble about misogyny and sexism, but you're right, there's sort of, you know, serious stuff goes on that just burbles along the bottom. The thing about women pay rates, you know, Gillard does a fair bit of work on that, women in boardrooms and stuff, and lends her name to some of those causes, but she doesn't highlight it a lot, you know, it's a good point. And the other, what was the other one? No, I don't think we write differently, we just write a lot quicker. You know, I've usually written probably 500 or 600 words by lunchtime now, whereas I didn't used to sit down and write till about 5 or 6 in the afternoon at night for the next day's paper. I've usually belted something out for the web, you know, by lunchtime, a 600 or 700 word piece, and then start thinking about the paper. So you know, it's faster and nastier, but it's not. You're still trying and maintain the same quality.
So the first one was sort of ABC and paywalls. We're Fairfax, like we're going behind a paywall next March. It'll be really interesting to see if anyone wants to pay for our copy. I think the news has become totally commoditised, so why would you pay for news on a Fairfax website when you can get it somewhere else? The only thing that you're going to pay for is sort of like opinion journalism, whether or not it's good or bad, but, you know, some branded people that you like to read and come back to, or exclusive stories. And as Phil says, exclusive stories are really, really, really expensive and time-consuming. Editors don't like them very much. So I worry about that, and I think public interest journalism will increasingly be relegated, be the domain of the ABC, because they can actually afford to do it, you know, programs like Four Corners and what have you. As for Abbott, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think you can have a debate about misogyny and sexism and, you know, how we talk, and also work on the policy side of things. I mean, the only observation I would make is that, like, coming up to the next election, there's going to be 2 competing models for maternity leave, paid maternity leave, which has never been something that parties have ever competed on before. And, you know, it's a small step forward, but it's a step forward. I mean, hallelujah. But I agree with you on the pay gap, definitely. And as for media and writing, I think, it's much more like quick and dirty kind of stuff. So you have to, as Phil said, you have to bash stuff out for the web. And as newsrooms become eroded of staff, you are obviously called upon to do more stuff. So taking like 5 days off to do an FOI and, you know, launch a full-scale investigation is not easy to do. Yeah.
Just a quick example, jump in. Yesterday they released the mid-year budget statement, right? So it's a big fat book full of economic data, and it's all the nasty stuff. And all the nasty stuff's hidden within, right? Now, in the oldie days, I'd pick that book up, lemon leaf through it, go to Gasper and a cup of coffee and a bit of lunch, you know, read it through the afternoon, go to the press conferences, you know, and do a really well thought out piece for the paper the next day. We'd have a story online in 5 minutes. And I just had to look at that thing, and it's only because I've done 1,000 budgets, you sort of know where to look. And just cherry pick, you know, the sexy stuff, you know, the childcare stuff, the company tax thing, whatever they notice, and just went bam, 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 bam. And one of my colleagues was just like cut and pasting, you know, reaction from a press release, and we had a 600-word story up in 8 minutes, you know, so that just over 8 minutes. And it held up pretty well, actually. I say it did, but and you know, you just have a heart attack doing that shit every day. But that's how you got off it, you know, but you've just got to be so assiduous when you're doing it because you have an error.
And if you make one error,
you make one error.
Every 800 people on Twitter.
Fucking freak on Twitter comes in. You know, and, your number was wrong. Oh. So that was a real example. That's the first time I've ever done a budget online like that real fast. And then I turned around and did a much more sort of well thought out piece for the paper. But,
there's a one of the things that, and I've not spoken to these two about this, but plenty of other gallery journalists have mentioned the same thing, which is that if you put a lot of effort into a piece, a lot of journalism, a lot of research, and produce a well thought through piece on a public policy matter, it'll be pretty much, it'll vanish without trace. There'll be, on Crikey side, there'll be a couple of comments, might be a couple of Twitter comments, but that's it. You dash off a 20-minute opinion piece off the top of your head saying, Abbott's a dickhead or and that'll go off, and it'll be retweeted endlessly, and you'll get loads of comments. And and of course the clicks are what counts now in the business model. So there is an inbuilt perverse disincentive or perverse incentive to just aim for lightweight comment rather than investing a lot of work in something that is actually going to add to the sum total.
And comment's cheap, it's free. I was saying opinions are like arseholes, everyone's got one. And it's just really easy just to and they do. And that's what we've got to be really careful about is opinion replacing news. There's more and more opinions everywhere. You can't escape it. You log on any blogs of opinion, they're not news. Twitter's largely opinion. It's just the balance between news and opinion has done that. And news, a dry news piece which sparks opinion. I mean, once news disappears, there's going to be nothing to have an opinion about. You know what I mean? So opinions about other people. You have opinions about people's opinions.
And people's appearances.
That's my great worry. Just sort of an onslaught of opinion. And everyone's a bloody expert and everyone knows what's going on. It's just not the case.
On the ABC, I mean, Phil's point, which is the James Murdoch point, is actually a sound one, which is that while there is a high quality source of free news and journalism, then it makes life very difficult for people who want to actually make money from it. That's just economics. And yet it seems to me that we continue to need a high quality independent media outlet, and that's going to be the ABC, because it can do things that the commercial media can't do, and it always will. No matter how you cut it. So we've got this basic dilemma that it is not going to be profitable for it's okay for Crikey. We make money from subscriptions, but as I said, as we said before, Crikey's atypical for a number of reasons. So we're not the model that's going to kind of work for the rest of the industry. And so there is this tension that's not resolved. It's not any closer to being resolved now than it was 5 years ago when people were talking about how do we resolve this problem of the internet eating our lunch. No one's got any closer to fixing it. Paywalls have kind of taken us a couple of steps in that direction. There's a lot of different kinds of paywalls. Some are more wallier than others, and some are pretty easy to bypass. And I'm just not sure that in a small market they're going to work particularly well. Australia's a small market. That's one of the big problems about the Australian media is we're only 22 million people. We can't support a lot of newspapers. We can't support a lot of news sites. Even in the old days, we couldn't support them.
Quick question, quick raise of hands. How many people actually buy a newspaper these days?
Oh wow.
That's about a fifth. Yeah, and that's put on the floor. Yeah, believe it or not, newspapers still make all the money. We still make $8 out of every newspaper. We still make $8 to 1 out of print versus online. And so the thing that funds the SMH website and everyone else over our newspapers, it ain't the website, and once the paper dies, and the papers are dying very quickly, the whole show will go to hit the fence, and it'll be a far more scaled down version of what you've got now. And I think, probably not being too pessimistic, if you look at the United States, they've gone through this 5 years ahead of us. A lot of big mastheads have collapsed. Some like the New York Times are being held up by benefactors, and they have really good websites, and they've made that transition. But you will probably see websites we don't know exist yet. Maybe an offshoot of a Sydney Morning Herald website, or maybe the Herald website, or the Age, or the Australian, or something will survive. Because at the end of the day, there's still going to be an appetite for good, objective news. And so something will rise out of whatever the ruin we're about to experience. But it will not be on the scale, you know, of the size and the number of journalists and employees that we've had in the era of newspapers. It just can't be. There's just too much money involved.
I can see another couple at least, so we'll go over here and then up to the back corner, and that might be all we have time for, I'm afraid, folks. Yes.
I'm Stuart, I'm a Woroni contributor. Two questions. Is the coffee stain sleep-deprived investigative journalist an endangered creature? And secondly, on an unrelated matter, what are your thoughts on the centralisation of news, so the closing of local news stations and the closing of local news outlets and the same use of the same articles and the same information across the country for different papers?
No, it's terrible, but it's just a consequence. I mean, just less diversity. You know, we're all going to be, you know, might as well all go home and just take wire copy eventually, the way it's sort of going, you know. It's just, but, you know, there is a big appetite for local news too. I think it's always underestimated. You'll probably find the last newspapers to disappear will be your little regional papers and things like the Adelaide Advertiser and the Brisbane Coorey Mail, because they carry a lot of local news in them. You know, the first papers disappear with the national ones, where that stuff can be replicated anywhere. So I think it's tragic, but it's just economics. You know, it's just not making money. And for other sections of the industry have already gone through this. I mean, regional radio is now almost entirely centralised, or regionalised. I mean, there's whole networks there that operate out of basically sort of one studio with you know, the occasional tiny bit of additional local content produced on the ground locally, and of course, crucially, the local ads, which regional radio owners like to tell us is local content. So radio's already gone through that. TV is going through it now. Ken's centralising further centralising its news bulletins. I mean, I think most of their news bulletins are from Sydney. You know, it will happen with newspapers. It is happening with newspapers. It's been happening for a while, I suspect. We're doing it with the Age now. You know, the Sydney Morning, the Herald, the Age, and even the Canberra Times now, where all our copy, if I write something, it can appear in any paper. And my front page story today in the Herald on the mini budget will also appear on the front page of the Age today for the first time. And they didn't use Michelle Grattan's story, they used mine instead because they liked it better. And I thought, I was happy about it because she'll do something they like better. And because Michelle and I are their respective, you know, and one day she'll do something they like better, and it'll be Michelle on the front of the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age. And that's, you know, that could have been two different stories people could have read, but they just got my version because they had a line in it they like better. And it's just, you know, and eventually one of us will disappear. You know, Michelle and I will disappear because there's no need for two correspondents. Now, we've got two correspondents working around the building, you've got twice the chance of finding something different. When they just go back to one correspondent for the Age and the Herald, you know, and then the Canberra Times by extension. You know, that's three opinions distilled, or three views, or three ability to find something distilled into one, and that's being replicated everywhere.
We'll go to one very final question right up the back. This will be the last cab off the rank. Over to you.
I share your concerns about you know, the future of quality journalism and who's going to do the FOI requests and travel and, you know, investigate things properly. But at the same time, I wonder if any of you, and particularly you, Jacqueline, would acknowledge that perhaps there could be some positives that will come from you know, the move online and the transformation of how the sources that we digest media from. And I have to say that the reporting on the speech actually got me feeling a bit positive for the first time because, you know, it's, as you suggested before, Jacqueline, you know, the press gallery that we have at present, you know, the majority of people there are white middle-aged men. They're not neutral. They don't. I'm sure that there is a genuine intention to be neutral and report the facts and sort of objectively decide what the story is for that day. But the limitation is the subjectivity of the majority of the people in there, and that comes through in who, you know, in the decision that's made about what the story is and the way that it's reported and so on. And where I had to turn to find what I thought the story was and what I thought was worthwhile and interesting was, and to find women as well, was primarily blogs and, you know, things like daily life and the drama and so on. So, I just wonder if you think that there could be some positives in terms of getting some more diversity
Yeah, I mean, there's been so much gloom and doom in our industry and in our company for so long, and at a certain point I get frustrated with it because I think, you know, the economic realities are what they are. There's nothing we can do about them. They're all forces beyond our control. We've got to get on with it. You know, people are still going to be buying them. You know, the Sydney Morning Herald still has life in it. News and good journalism still has a lot of life in it, and what we're seeing now is a beautiful and wonderful democratisation of news and opinion and all of this, you know, kaleidoscopic stuff that we can see on the internet, and it's really exciting. And as you say, like, I mean, Phil was sort of saying, you know, you can shop around for the facts or the opinion that you like. Well, maybe that's not such a bad thing, and maybe we need to stop treating people like idiots and like we've got to mediate information for them or tell them the things that they should consider important above and beyond other things. It's just, you know, the wider conversation is about, you know, it's like populism versus leadership in politics, I suppose. Like the old school newspaper had an editor, you know, who was a pipe smoking bloke at the top of it, who curated or decided what were, you know, with a view to what was going to entertain and what his readers wanted to hear, but also with a sort of, I suppose, a leadership or an editorial role which said, I think that they should know about this, or I think this is a worthy thing. And but let me tell you, in the times that I've been working in newspapers, half the time that's because, you know, the editor himself got stuck on the M5 that morning, therefore he wants a story about the M5 in the paper. Like, it's not like it's, no, seriously, like quite seriously. It's not like it's coming from some worthy, high-minded place necessarily, it's coming from the subjective viewpoint of that bloke. So the more viewpoints, the better. And yes, I'm very positive about the future of media. I think we're going to be doing more with less money, but journalists have always been poorly paid, and they've always been ink-stained, and they've always, you know, you guys could all make much more money doing something else, but there's probably people here who want to be journalists, so, yeah.
Very briefly, any final thoughts? Thank you.
Yeah, just very good point. I welcome the extra scrutiny social media provides. People can now watch a press conference and then ring you up 5 minutes after they read the story you post online that press conference and challenge your version of it. And it happens. It's happened a few times where they tweet you, go, I just watched that, I've watched it live on Sky News, and he didn't say that, or that's not what he was saying, you've misrepresented him. And you get it all the time now. So, you know, your interpretation is no longer, you know, sacrosanct. People can witness the event, read the entire statement from the Reserve Bank Governor on the way lowered interest rates and challenge your interpretation of it. I think it's a good thing. That's my point is, my point is, it's fine. I welcome more, you know, more diverse sort of, you know, mediums and so forth, but you've got to have the same standards. You've still got to. We're bound by defamation and libel and the need to be objective and the need to get both sides of the story. And what my complaint is, that's gone out the door in a lot of these, you know, social media things, and people say stuff which isn't fact checked, which is not necessarily objective, which is not necessarily balanced, and that's being perceived as fact, and it's not being challenged. And I think there's a different set of standards, a lower set of standards now starting to apply more generally outside the traditional media, and that I think is dangerous.
Bernard, final comment?
Look, Phil's right, there are very different standards out there in the conversation that's going on, in the communities that people are forming and have formed using the interconnectedness that the internet provides, but like, I mean, there's nothing we can do about it. People are having these conversations, people are forming these communities, they are empowered and they are using that power, and there's no stopping that, despite, however we may feel about it. But come back to the point I think that Phil made earlier. Look, at some point there needs to continue to be some sort of model that is going to produce high quality journalism, and you know, the economics are not favourable to that. At this point, they've never been favourable to high quality journalism. It's always been subsidised by advertising, and that model, which has existed since the 18th century in England, is dying, and there is a real civic question about implications for a world where there's much less high quality journalism than we used to.
And on that civic question, we will have to wrap ourselves up for this evening. I would like to first and foremost thank our three panellists, Bernard, Phillip and Jacqueline. Round of applause. I'd also like to pay tribute tribute to the editorial team at Woroni for putting on such a fantastic event and for bringing all of this together. They've done a splendid job. Everything that you've witnessed here has been recorded. No doubt it's about to go viral. Somewhere, somehow, these things always do. A final, perhaps university-related reflection on this. Of course, here at the ANU we do not teach journalism, but we have plenty of future journalists, always have, and I hope very much always will. I was, once upon a time, I noted that one of you introduced yourself as a former editor of Woroni. I also wear that hat, funnily enough. Love Woroni to pieces. Student journalism, grown-up journalism, if you will. It's all wonderful to me, and long may it prosper. Thank you all very much.